at times they've become very bureaucratic. So.
Ma'am, it's the same problem here, but Odisha, and I proudly say that in the last decade at least, has been a benchmark for disaster management and disaster management relief. The state government made many efforts, some of them really novel, like the identification, displacement, and the state government, especially our Honorable Chief Minister, he was lauded for these efforts. And Odisha, due to the one line which stands out, he said that I cannot avert the disaster from coming, but I can protect my people from the disaster. And that is something why even today we miss him. And I hope the whole country and later on the whole world can take a page from his book, and we can be better prepared, because I think it is some part of it is inevitable. We can't avoid it. It's mother nature, or it's man-made, or whatever it is. We can't avoid it, but the best we can do is be ready for it, prepare well, and make sure that the help goes to the people who need it the most.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I think it's already time here. Maybe just less than a minute to go. So then I'll hand over to the host, and accordingly she will introduce you, and we'll start. So I mean, there are a lot of students who will be joining, I think, hopefully.
Wonderful.
Soon. So, and I mean, I remember listening to you back in Rabat. So and then also talking to you outside of course, the Congress, and all the experiences, including your own interesting take on environmental law. So, I mean, I'm really looking forward to a very interesting session in that sense.
Yeah, and the students who are with us today are very lucky to have you as their professor.
So. No, it's the other way around. I think we are lucky to have you here. But yeah, I mean, it's always a pleasure teaching to the bunch of students. I was lucky enough to get a good bunch of students, not in sense of grades, but in sense of their interest in many of the areas that I teach. So hopefully that trend continues.
Yeah, we're all part of a bigger sort of question of how we all can make contributions, and this is a multi-generational effort.
Right. Then Pradipta, I think I'll hand it over to you. Pradipta is there?
Yes, sir. Am I audible and visible? All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and a warm welcome to all our attendees. I'm Pradipta Roy, the student co-convener of the Center for Disaster Management and Law of National Law University, Odisha. On behalf of the Center for Disaster Management and Law, National Law University, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for the day. We are honored to have you with us, Dr. Anastasia Telesetsky, a professor of environmental law at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Dr. Telesetsky is a leading scholar in disaster and environmental law. She has also co-edited the International Law of Disaster Relief, which contributes to the Yearbook of International Disaster Law, and has played a significant role in shaping global disaster law and policy. Today, she'll be delivering her lecture on the role of international environmental law in fostering disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. We are so thrilled to have her here with us to share her expertise. I would now request all of you to please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Anastasia Telesetsky. Professor, the session is all yours.
Thank you very much, and it is a real honor to be with you this morning. And I'm going to quickly share my screen. I think I need to locate. Sorry, where is it? This is one moment. Let me see if I can share it this way. Okay. I apologize. I think I closed my screen. I will reopen it right now quickly, and there it is. And then let me come on back to the Google. My apologies. I should have kept the screen up when I had it up. I have my screen. I'm trying to figure out how to share the PowerPoint, so my apologies on this.
Professor, don't worry, take your time. That's
I can share my entire screen. Perhaps I'll share my entire screen and then I'll be able to, that will probably be the easiest. So you can let me know if, are you folks, this is not the PowerPoint I'm sharing. Are you folks able to see a PowerPoint?
No, Professor.
No. Okay, let me try again. I may have to figure out how the entire screen doesn't work then. Environmental law. Let me do that now. Okay, one moment. I will try again. I have it up on my screen, but I'm not able to share it with you. What I could do possibly is send it. Meet needs permission to screen share.
somebody you can
Just-
guide, Professor.
Would you like me to send
yes,
it to
sir.
you?
Yes, Professor.
Let
I
me-
can share it then.
Let me do that right now. And let me share. And I apologize. Technical issues here. I'm not accustomed to Google Meet, and apparently neither is my computer. So I'm sending it here to the center right now. Is that the best place for me to send it?
Yes, Professor. No, we are very thankful for you to join us at Google Meet.
Attachments are still loading. You can send. Okay. Okay. It should be on its way to you right now. So.
Yes, Professor.
And in the meantime, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll give you a little background. I'm going to be talking today not just about disaster law, because we have a whole field, obviously, of international disaster law, and a lot of that focuses on disaster relief. But I really want to spend my time, once I can get the slides shared with you folks, talking about disaster risk reduction and talking about in the context of environmental law. And yeah, I'm a little surprised that the Google Meet won't let me share with you guys.
Somebody you can share it. I think the mail is already here.
Yes, I'm doing it right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And so I have a sort of an opening where you'll see very, very shortly. I'm going to take you to China to reflect on the earthquake that happened in China. And once it's the slides are up, I wanted to talk with you folks a little bit about, oh, perfect. Thank you very much. So if we can go to the second slide, that would be perfect. So good morning, everyone. I wanted to talk to you folks as a start about Sichuan, China, and what happened there in May 2008. Northwest of Chengdu, which is a relatively large city, a 7.9 to 8.3 magnitude earthquake shook China. And it didn't just shake China. It shook the neighboring state of Vietnam, and it also impacted, oh, I guess, is it still showing or not showing? That's fine. It impacted Shanghai, it impacted Beijing, and ultimately caused about 100, thank you very much, caused about $190 billion worth of disaster. This was one of the largest disasters in the world in terms of its cost at the time. And it had, it was a major event. leading to 284 aftershocks that were considered major aftershocks, 43,000 total aftershocks, and ended up leading to 87,000 people losing their lives, 18,000 people going missing, 375,000 individuals being seriously injured. So in the next slide, I asked this question, if you don't mind advancing. What happened next? What do you think happened next? In this kind of situation, you have a situation of almost total chaos, and anything could possibly happen. You could have people looting. You could have crime in the streets as people go into survival mode. But what actually happened, if we go to the next slide, is that we had what we would consider a really significant event with what was called by some catastrophe compassion. And this is really quite significant because during a disaster event, we find that people, and this has empirically been sort of proven again and again, we see far more generosity. We saw people bringing in goods. We saw people offering free services. We saw neighbors reaching out to others who they may or may not have had a connection with. And we saw this catastrophe compassion. And moving to the next slide, I asked this question: if disaster relief brings out the best in each of us, can we bring a better version of ourselves to disaster risk reduction? Because we don't see the same phenomena of catastrophe compassion. That's very much something that's in the moment. So moving to the next slide, and I apologize that I'm not able to move these forward because it's a lot of effort for you. I want to make the suggestion that we can bring our best selves, but we have to, and this is kind of the theme of this particular lecture, we need to take international environmental law commitments seriously. And moving to the next slide, these are the questions that I want to discuss today. What does international environmental law have to do with disasters? How can international environmental law avert conditions associated with disaster? And then what is lacking in international environmental law implementation? And then a very final question before I conclude is asking about a concept of solidarity. And this is a legal concept. How can we apply this emerging concept of international solidarity to advance better international environmental law outcomes? And so what can we do in terms of disaster law frameworks? So these are the questions that I'm going to touch on in the next few minutes that I have together with you. So moving to the next slide, it's really important when we're talking about what a disaster is. And a kind of very basic concept is to think about disaster as not simply about the event. And I think everyone who is involved with the center knows this well. It's always the event plus the vulnerability of the communities, the vulnerability of the environment itself. To the extent that the event, whether it's an earthquake or a cyclone or a fire, plus the vulnerabilities of both the human communities and the ecological communities, to the event that that is greater, you know, and if we were to sort of think about this in a sort of quantitative manner, that it's greater to the capacity to respond, that's when we have a disaster. And so I want to talk about a series of sort of disasters in the coming minutes. But as the next slide will show you, a very important concept of international environmental law is the precautionary principle. And so you folks know the idioms of, that the ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, or, don't put off tomorrow what you should be doing today. The idea of precaution creating momentum to act. And this concept was initially negotiated by states at the Rio Plus 20 meeting when they created the Declaration for Sustainable Development, the Environment and Development. And it was articulated, and I've provided language from the Convention on Biodiversity here, but it's more or less the same language with the same principle, that as long as we have threats that are going to cause harm, in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, cause harm to biological diversity, or in the case of the Climate Convention, cause harm to the climate, as long as we have these situations, even if we have a lack of full scientific certainty, we don't have all the evidence possible would help us to make a decision, that is not a reason that we should not be acting. And this becomes really important when we think about disaster risk reduction, that the precautionary principle reminds us that things that today might be challenging to get implemented, that we still have obligations to be thinking about how do we do the kind of planning that's essential, not simply for the next year or the year out, but thinking kind of in a long-term fashion. So moving to the next slide, precautionary principle has really been a challenge. It's been a global challenge. And in fact, we've had this kind of shared inability across many nations to exercise precaution. And what we've ended up doing, and this is the argument I want to make, is we've created for ourselves a whole series of disasters that we might otherwise have been able to avert by exercising the precautionary principle. And so I just give a couple examples here of where we have, I think, collectively not done a sort of excellent job of exercising precaution. We are still today extracting 8.5 billion tons of coal per year. Coal, of course, is heavy in particulates, a greenhouse gas driver. So we essentially have about a ton of coal coming out of the earth still per person. Obviously, we need energy, but this raises one of the questions about whether we began to sort of exercise the precautionary principle early enough. We know that today we have really high levels of air pollution. And today that is one of the major drivers of mortality, where we have 9 out of 10 people breathing relatively unhealthy air across the globe, with 1 out of 10 deaths having some attribution to air pollution, to the aggravation from exposure to particulates or exposure to volatile organic contaminants. We have today sea level rise. We know we're seeing different amounts of sea level rise in different parts of the world, but an average of about 3.4 millimeters. So obviously low-lying areas are experiencing this more rapidly than other areas. And then we continue to use vast amounts of pesticide, where we haven't necessarily been able to make those kind of transitions to more sustainable pest management. So we still use globally, I just pulled these figures earlier this week, of about 4 to 5.6 billion pounds of pesticide. So moving to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to ground this in the sort of disaster law concepts. And tail risk is, to me, a really important concept to discuss. And what I hope you'll take away from my comments here is when we're sort of dealing with the kind of precautionary issues that I just shared with you, we're really thinking about issues that have been conceived of as these kind of long-tail disasters. And so we have, things that clearly fit like a cyclone, which is low probability, high impact. And investors try to plan for these events. And they're concerned because obviously there's property damage, there's loss of life. And with long-tail disasters, we have certain kinds of risk management practices. But we also, in addition to long-tail disasters, have fat-tail disasters. And that's the image that I have on this slide here, where you'll see that we have high-impact events that should, in theory, be low probability, but are actually occurring much more often than we expected them to occur. And so you can see in the graph that the orange line represents the fat-tail distribution. So you end up with the events happening more often, and you have more loss as a result. I suggest that environmental challenges have become these kind of fat tail risk problems. And they're fat tail risk problems that really require a disaster law management lens. And so if we move to the next slide, I'm going to go through a series of examples here where I'll present some international environmental law and suggest that we have a disaster emerging, and then share with you what some of the responses have been. So I'm not sort of analyzing the responses because I have sort of a summary at the end of these slides where I'm going to share with you what I think is happening with the collective responses. But biodiversity is kind of a classic example of where international environmental law plays a significant role. The disaster I'd like to suggest to you is that we have an ongoing trend of habitat loss. And as we lose our habitat, we begin to destroy kind of a shared biological legacy. This is something we inherited from the generation before us, and we are not at this time in our human history passing on to the generations that are coming the same biological legacy that we inherited. We're losing a lot of genetic diversity. We are finding our habitats being increasingly fragmented. So one of the things that we're seeing also is species extinction. And this really, I'd like to suggest, is a becoming that fat tail problem, because it should be low probability that you lose a species, albeit of course high impact. But the actual current rate of species extinctions is tens to hundreds of times higher than the average rate has been over the last 10 million years. And many of these losses have been in the last several decades. And there are many, many reasons that are driving that. So what's been our response? What's been the kind of legal response to what I suggest to you is a disaster? Because we seem to be having the event, the losses. We obviously have very vulnerable ecosystems. I put a coral reef here as one example, and it's overwhelming our capacity to respond. So we have a number of responses. One in particular, I'd like to just talk with you about the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was adopted at the Rio meeting in 1992, which was the UN Convention on Sustainable Development. And countries agreed that biodiversity would be considered to be a common concern of humankind, and that there was intention for us to sort of work collectively to figure out how we could use the biological resources in a sustainable fashion. And so our response has been that's our international response, and our sort of domestication of this responsibility is to create national goals for biodiversity. So we have a whole lot of national programs that have been designed. And these programs are intended to create in situ conservation efforts as well as ex situ conservation efforts. So in situ would be, for example, protecting a habitat by designating it to be a national reserve or a national park. An ex situ conservation situation may be to have a zoological park where you are protecting a particularly rare species and trying to do a breeding program, for example. So on terms of biodiversity, we have a disaster and we have this kind of response. I'd like to talk about another area of international environmental law. So if we can move to the next slide. Illegal wildlife trade, not quite the same as biodiversity. Here, we're seeing similar impacts. We're seeing species loss, but we're also seeing human disease as part of the illegal wildlife trade. This is a big enterprise. It's one of the largest of the criminal enterprises, worth, by some estimates, up to about $10 billion. And I put an example in here because we're seeing that some of this illegal wildlife trade, and one example is a trade in bushmeat that happens in places such as West Africa, where it is a desired product by local residents there. We're seeing a decline in species, but we're also seeing an increase in zoonotic diseases. And so there are diseases such as Ebola, and some other serious pandemic diseases that have been attributed to a increasing amount of consumption and contact with wildlife. And much of that has been attributed, and we can talk about that to in particular, consumption of bats. What's our collective response been in this area? We have the World Health Organization that's working on this, but from an international environmental law perspective, we have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora. And what this has essentially done is nation by nation, each country has a management authority and a scientific authority who's intended to have oversight and have regulations in place and designate animals that are threatened and endangered, and provide oversight on any trade that might be in that particular of those species. So again, a disaster and a response. Another area on the next slide involves, if we can advance to the next slide, hazardous waste and toxins. So again, we have a similar sort of set of a disaster. We have public health concerns that have been raised by exposure of many individuals to toxic metals, to petrochemicals, to pesticides, to, in some cases, radioactive material. There's a very big trade in waste and toxics. This is an international trade. And I just give one example of kind of mismanaged trade. Where we have in 1987, 18,000 barrels of hazardous waste were exported from Italy, from a sort of major company in Italy. And they had contracted with a local farmer in Nigeria, and he was going to dispose of this material on his farm. They were going to pay him $100 a month for this. And lo and behold, when all of this, these barrels of waste showed up in the Nigerian port, they were in poor condition, they were leaking. There was no possibility that someone without, advanced hazardous waste management skills would have been able to manage the crisis that arrived on the Nigerian shore. This has been a kind of chronic problem. What's the collective response been? There's been several responses, but a couple just to call out to everyone here. The Basel Convention from 1989 was adopted in part in response to the incidents that I just mentioned in Nigeria. And then the Bamako Convention was adopted after that because the African Union was particularly concerned that the Basel Convention was not protective enough. What's supposed to happen is to avoid disaster. There's meant to be a process with prior informed consent. There's meant to be a due diligence effort to make sure that whoever receiving state of hazardous waste is actually able to process that waste in a manner that will not expose the public to undue health concerns. So here's yet a third example that I want to present to you. So to suggest that we have a disaster and response. A fourth example we have with air pollution. Again, we have a disaster of public health, and I mentioned this when I talked about the precautionary principle. The statistics are very high that we have most countries in the world exceed particulate matter levels. And this is on a regular basis. Particulate matters are particularly problematic. This is often referred to as PM 2.5, very fine particles that lodge in lungs and lead to a variety. They increase cardiovascular risk. They have impacts on the ability to recover from things like pneumonia. And it's really a public health burden. What's our response been here? Well, there's been a variety of international responses. So we have some things such as the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention. This was adopted to create ceilings on the amount of pollution, so that a recognition, of course, that pollution doesn't stay within its own geographic boundaries. And so we had protocols that were subsequently negotiated to sort of set additional limits. Different measures were taken for nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, other sorts of criteria pollutants for which there was great concern that these were having public health impacts. We also have things like the Montreal Protocol that have been negotiated. This involves ozone depleting substances, again, having public health concerns. The original concerns were the ozone hole, opening up over the two poles, bringing in, of course, exposing individuals to more ultraviolet radiation, the UV from the sun, and creating, of course, more skin cancer. We've been quite successful. This is one of the sort of high points from at least a precautionary principle. We've done well on phasing out ozone depleting substances. We've actually seen recovery of the ozone hole has reduced in size, and we've seen more protective, the areas that had exposure, which were primarily places like Australia, are having less of UV exposure for their residents. So disaster and collective response. And I have just a couple more examples. The next example is water pollution. This again involves public and environmental health. A quick example, this is an image of a fish kill due to eutrophication. Eutrophication is often caused by harmful algal blooms, which can result from excess nutrients that enter waterways and compromise water quality. We've had a variety of collective responses here. So we have different land-based pollution protocols that are part of our regional seas conventions, but we also have the so-called Watercourse Convention, which was adopted in 1997. And it creates some different practices for states. It says, states should have equitable utilization of waters if they're sharing waterways, but they also have obligations not to cause transboundary harm and to prevent the potential of a public health crisis, or to prevent the potential of an environmental health crisis. There's also some interesting protocols, and I put one down here from the Black Sea region in Europe, which is a response to some of these concerns about non-point source pollution, particularly from agricultural uses. So they have created for themselves, the states that are involved with that, They have efforts to create caps for how much fertilizer should be applied in various states in that region. And they have a somewhat complex mechanism trying to respond to the disaster that's been created and reduce the risk. And then the final example that I have on the next slide is, second to final example. This is desertification. This is very much related to obviously climate concerns. This becomes a disaster of public livelihoods. This is across the globe, areas are experiencing desertification. California has been experiencing desertification. India probably also has challenges. This is impacting billions of people. So if we're around 8.5 billion people, almost, if you think about that, nearly a quarter of our population is experiencing desertification. What does that mean? That means we're losing fertile soil. We're losing the ability, we're losing food security. And obviously it doesn't just impact us, our human communities, but also our ecological communities as they begin to lose access to water or plants that species depend on for their food sources are no longer available. We do have a collective response. We do have a convention that's been negotiated. And under this particular treaty, similar to the biodiversity treaty, we have these national action programs. There is also work under this treaty to ensure more robust financial and technical assistance programs to try to help with providing, in particular, cash flow to be able to do replanting programs where that's possible, to be able to provide water sources for communities that have lost water sources. So a major disaster, a looming disaster that requires obviously active precaution. Final slide on this particular point is about the most pressing concerns that we have, which is climate. And we have greenhouse gas, increases in greenhouse gas. I was looking up earlier today, we're now at 431, it's either 422 or 431 parts per million, which is far above the so-called safe threshold of 350 parts per million, where scientists have told us that we're less likely to see major shifts, major threshold shifts, and to have more resilience in our ecological systems. So we're beyond that at this point. And obviously we know what the disasters are. Much has been written on this from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a major topic of interest for insurance companies. This is front of mind for some nations with extreme weather, loss of food security, impacts on a variety of species. And I put this in just as a reminder that we're not exercising our precaution, because even as of this year, we still have about 1% increase in the amount of emissions coming from our fossil fuels. So we're not decreasing fossil fuel use yet. The major collective response here has been, of course, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. As we talk here, folks are in Belém, Brazil, with the Conference of Parties for both of these treaties. And the major mechanism right now is trying to design nationally determined contributions that are capable of being implemented and actually meet the targets. I mean, we must stay below the 2 degrees. That's the commitment that's been made in the Paris Agreement, but we're also aiming to be closer to 1.5, no more than 1.5 degrees of warming. There are other aspects of this treaty that are, from my perspective, part of the disaster risk reduction strategy. We have a green climate funds, and we also have loss and damage funds that have been introduced. I mean, these are somewhat nascent, and particularly the loss and damage fund is quite new, and how that will actually be delivered is I think a very significant question, and how that can be delivered, especially to be able to provide for disaster risk reduction. So that brings me then to the next point that I want to make, which is I've just talked to you a lot about a whole bunch of international environmental legal instruments. And so in theory, if every one of these instruments in good faith was being implemented, we wouldn't be facing some of the current global, regional, national challenges that we have. And so one of the challenges has been, why is it that there's so much less attention given to many of these legal frameworks? And I'd like to suggest that sometimes it's a question of urgency. The politicians don't see the matters that are in these kinds of conventions to be matters of public urgency. Sometimes there's been a lack because there hasn't been interest in protection of the public's interest at large. Rather, in many states, and I'll speak about the US in this particular case, there's a protection of private interests. We have an administration right now with, I would say, even more than just disinterest in international environmental law. It's sort of active resistance to implementing things that are within the public's interest, and particularly within long-term public interest. And then in some instances, and this may be the case for a number of countries that are in transition in terms of economic development, there may be indeed a lack of capacity, a lack of technical capacity, and always there is a lack of money to do full implementation. So these are all challenges that face implementation of the types of instruments that I just talked about. But that brings me to the next slide, which is I'm asking the very same question that I started with. Can we bring a better version of ourselves to disaster risk reduction? And, you know, the we here can be many we's. It can be obviously individuals. It can be nations. It can be private companies. It can be a whole lot of different actors. And so the next slide says, yes, we can bring a better version of ourselves, but what we have to do is build a norm for a culture of care. And this is not really language that gets a lot of attention at sort of with international diplomacy, but I think it's quite significant to think about what does it mean to build a culture of care that then becomes the basis for implementation. It becomes the basis for how it's value driven, you know, so that so much of the conversation when we talk about sustainability has become very much a question of sort of cost benefit analysis. But the culture of care is something I'd like to suggest to you much bigger than that. Now, the next slide is a very cynical slide. The next slide here says, because I suggest that to build a culture of care, you have to recognize that we're in the same boat. Some people would then say, but we're not in the same boat. What are you talking about? You know, we're existing in the same storm, but some people have far greater advantage than others. And some are continually trying to play catch up. And to some extent, there's truth to that when you think about sort of technical and financial capacity. But I sort of am an optimist on this. So the next slide reminds us that we are in the same boat in a stormy sea, the same language from that last slide. And this is the very, very important part of this in thinking about culture of care. We owe each other a terrible loyalty. And these are words from an English author from the beginning of the 20th century, who captures this idea of what is on the next slide, the principle of international solidarity. Underpinning any disaster risk reduction work, that my argument here includes implementation of international environmental law commitments, is this expression of unity that is not only a state-based effort. It includes people, it includes individuals, it includes peoples, it includes businesses, it includes municipalities, it includes provinces, it includes nations, it includes regional organizations, it includes international organizations. It is a comprehensive effort to create that culture of care that I was suggesting. What are we intending to do with this? Create for ourselves the future we want, one that is the UN Charter's language, seeking something that is peaceful, just, and equitable, securing rights, and ensuring sustainable development. And so part of this is where the international environmental law concept comes in. So on the next slide, what I'd like to suggest to you folks is that solidarity must underpin disaster law, which means investment in disaster risk reduction from all governance agents, as well as individuals and communities. So disaster risk reduction must include not simply the major disasters that we always report on and we see in the news that are extraordinary tragedies, personal tragedies, but also these daily disasters, which are what is covered with international environmental law, the questions of air quality, the questions of water quality, the questions of not having exposures to hazardous waste and toxins, the questions of being able to reduce greenhouse gases. So how would this actually work in practice? Part of it would be new institutional framing, because environmental agencies must consider themselves to also be disaster mitigation agencies. That has to be part of their mandate and priority. And so we see a little bit of this already happening, but not a whole lot when you go to look at disaster risk reduction laws. A whole lot of countries have combined climate change adaptation and disaster risk. So we see that in a lot of sort of legislative frameworks. And Ecuador has done something a little bit more interesting. They are looking at their long-term risk planning, and they take into consideration environmental considerations. Part of this may have to do with Ecuador as one of the few countries that has rights of nature, and that may be part of why this is in play in Ecuador. But there are other countries such as Tonga, who use a multi-hazard approach to disaster risk management, and they expect their local management committees who are doing the implementation work to take into consideration important environmental considerations when they are doing their disaster risk reduction planning. So there are, I think, some institutional opportunities. And then a second point that I think is really important is mainstreaming a concept of environmental health into disaster law, which means that we begin to prioritize human and environmental health outcomes over profits. And so this sounds a little bit on the political side, but it's a call to say that the right to a healthy environment, which over 150 countries have some version of that, some in their constitutions, some in statutory law, that the right to healthy environment is also implemented through doing disaster risk reduction work that involves environmental concerns. And so I think the two pair very nicely, bringing me to my second to last slide, which looks at one possibility of how this gets implemented. What does this look like practically? Because what I've just discussed with you might seem a little bit abstract. This means implementing those action plans that we already have. So doing the work that we already have with the biodiversity plans, doing the work that we already have with existing climate plans. But it's not simply government actors. It's not something that other society actors can simply take as sort of remain passive on. We require something that's active. And so in terms of being active here, we need to really accelerate active planning and implementation of large ecosystem restoration projects. Because many of these projects will address some of the concerns that I've raised here with desertification, with water quality, with cleaning up contaminated lands, concerns with hazards, with restoring biodiversity onto the land. And this must be done not just at the national level, but also at the subnational level. And so this is one opportunity to pursue disaster risk reduction. And this is, in fact, a sort of golden moment for this because we are currently in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. And so here's an opportunity for us to practice solidarity, to be looking within our own communities at how we can possibly do the kind of implementation that's needed in order to be able to create the kind of good life that residents and citizens of every nation expect as part of their sort of human inheritance. We expect to be able to live on lands that are abundant because that's what we inherited that from our forefathers. It is our duty to our coming generations. And so the last thing I want to say before having a conversation with you folks about some of the topics that I've raised here is it's really important for us to think like an ecosystem. And so having the chance to share with you in India here, of course, I wanted to share something from Mahatma Gandhi. And I think you know this quote, it's a powerful quote. And in particular, I wanted to sort of emphasize the language there about the thoughts. If you create a culture of care, that then becomes what your law is. And what your law is then becomes how you act as a community. And how you act becomes your habits. And of course, that becomes the values of the generations to come. And that's the destiny. And then Douglas B. Wheeler, you won't know who he is. He worked in the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. And I really love this quote because it says, when you're trying to halt the decline of an ecosystem, you must think like an ecosystem. And I think that's where we come into this, thinking as disaster law scholars and practitioners and as environmental law scholars and practitioners. And finally, a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, a major civil rights activist in the United States. He sums it up, I think, well. He says, it boils down to this: all life is interrelated. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. And that really sums up the principle of solidarity that I have suggested to you really needs to underpin disaster risk reduction work and international environmental law implementation. And so those are my remarks, and I very much welcome a conversation with you folks. So thank you for sharing those slides, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Professor, that was a very, am I audible? Professor, that was a very enlightening slideshow. I was very glad that I could see it for the first time on my own screen since I was sharing it. And if you are okay with it, we could move on to the question and answer session.
Absolutely.
So Thank you once again, Professor Anastasia, for that fantastic lecture. My name is Sameer Panda. I'm the student convener for the center. I just wanted to introduce myself since I forgot to do it in the beginning. We will now move on to the question and answer session. So if anyone has any questions for Professor Anastasia, feel free to type them in the chat box or use the raise hand feature and you can speak it out. So please go ahead. Preeti ma'am has a question.
Hello, Professor Anastasia. So my name is Kriti and I'm a faculty advisor for the center. I had a very basic question. If you have read the news, in India we are facing a severe case of air pollution in Delhi, which is also the capital city. So now this has become like an annual event every year in winter. When the winters start approaching, we see that the AQI goes very high and it becomes difficult for people to go for their daily activities also because there's difficulty in breathing and people who are suffering from lung issues or let's say who are asthmatic, they have a lot of concerns around this problem. So now that we have already crossed the stage where we can actively do something to prevent that, because it cannot be undone since it has become an annual event, do you think there are some risk mitigation strategies which we can adopt now so that let's say for the next year when the same time arrives, so that time we can actually do something to ensure that the severe AQI levels can be leveled down?
No, it's a really important question. I think some of that might have to do, and I don't know about Indian air pollution specifically, but I think one of the things might be trying to figure out the sources. What are this? I mean, and I can imagine what some of the sources might be, perhaps from transport, perhaps from power plants, And one of the big challenges has been, there's a number of questions, frankly, because some of this may be a question of enforcement. I don't again know Delhi's air, but I know India's got a clean air laws, and I know that they're well-written laws. Enforcement is always a challenge. And obviously there are political issues sometimes with enforcement. I very much appreciate that. From a disaster risk reduction, what my call for in part with the presentation is the solidarity means it's not just the government's challenge. This really is that businesses, to the extent that they have created a disaster situation, have responsibility to be addressing, and to be making the kinds of changes that need to be made. Communities are often the victims in these situations, but to the extent that a community is a contributor, they may also need to be responding in kind. If you have individuals who are using, certain kinds of, I don't know exactly what they might be using, diesel vehicles, for example, that might be contributing regularly. These are the sort of small things that individuals, and I also understand there are equity issues. I appreciate that, because I know that sometimes, and this was the case in the US, some of the dirtiest vehicles are people who have the least socioeconomic means, to be electrifying a car or doing something that might be reducing. I do wonder with the transport, and this is just, I don't know, and please share with me, does India have what is, they call in the US a cash for clunkers, where they give people cash to get vehicles off of the road that are in poor condition?
I think we do have some regulations where the government from time to time, they come up with laws that some vehicles which have crossed, let's say, 10 years of age needs to be taken away from the roads. But I don't think so, that I'm not sure about it. Maybe Kumarjeep sir can help me out if they have been paid compensation for that. I'm not sure about that.
Compensation is part of, especially in states, because the road, the transport departments are controlled by the state governments. So we have a federal system where we have a central government as well as we have the state governments. So each state comes up with their own laws based on what is the requirement. So for example, in Delhi, the law is more stringent because of the pollution. And so ideally after 10 years, generally either re-registration or they have to be taken off the roads. So scrappage now, in India, we have a new scrappage policy under which after a certain age, the vehicles go for scrappage. So after a certain age, in fact, it becomes mandatory for scrappage. So again, it differs from state to state, but these are some of the changes in law that has been very recent in that sense. Yeah.
Ma'am, with due respect, long answer short, in the state of Odisha, we have no such policy. If your car is old and is as an emission problem for the state, you can't use it anymore, but you won't be compensated for it.
Okay. And I could imagine there being resistance and challenges in implementing that.
If you're okay with it, Professor, we can move on to the second question.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, please.
Kanishk, sir.
Good morning, Professor. Good evening to you also, since it's evening there. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. We learned a lot, especially with regards to disaster risk reduction. I have a short question which comes from my experience in our state of Odisha. A lot of times when disaster happens, the poor get affected and they lose their belongings, they lose their households, the cattle, the crops. But the problem is that the relief which government announces does not reach them. And one of the problems is corruption, right? Right? So do you have similar problems in US? And if you do have, how do you tackle them? How do you ensure that people actually get relief?
We have less of a corruption, but a lot of bureaucracy. And so some of the most vulnerable communities, when disaster hits, and a kind of a classic example of this was the Hurricane Katrina, when that hit the southeast of the US. We had a large number. New Orleans has a large Black population who are socioeconomically more vulnerable than other communities. And so when the hurricane hit, many other communities had access to transport and they left the city. And these individuals were left behind in terrible situations. And the question then became disaster response, and the bureaucracy led to a slow response in that case, and to a lot of people receiving exposures losing their homes, being stranded in water. So one of the challenges has been, and that's true in the US, you'll often see the Red Cross is making some of the first responses in these kinds of situations as our government is attempting to sort of get things into order. And then you also see what I mentioned, that sort of catastrophe compassion. You see a lot of private assistance coming in from a variety of groups who have they have storage of canned goods or whatever, clothing. We saw this really recently in California with the fires. We had some major fires in Los Angeles, and that was some of the first responses were community-based responses. And so, yeah, we also have the corruption. And one of the things that we do have a few laws that have to sometimes be enforced, because after an emergency, a tragedy happens, a catastrophe happens, there are a few business people who try to charge people, who have nothing, like crazy amounts of money, for basic goods. And there are laws preventing that. And those will be enforced, because it's taking advantage of people,
Thank you.
We'll move on to the next one. Daniel?
Yes. Am I visible? Hi, Professor. First of all, thank you for that wonderful talk. My question is somewhat specific to America. When I look at the American administration, particularly the federal administration, what I see is a sense of apathy towards climate change and environmental issues, right? And it's different for us here in India because climate change is not a partisan issue. This doesn't mean there are no political problems that come about when we're talking about the environment, or that we do everything we're supposed to do diligently, but it's not a partisan issue like it is in America. And I say it is in America because a good example of this is Trump leaving the Paris Agreement, Biden rejoining, and then Trump leaving once again. So my question is, how is it like operating in a framework like that when you're working on environmental issues, right? When you're working on research on environmental issues or environmental law, how is it to operate in a framework like that? What is it like?
That's a great question. Challenging to say the least. So one of the biggest challenges we have is at our federal level, we have a lot more resources. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing state to state response. So the Belém conference, the US had no one sitting at the plenary. I don't know if they eventually showed up at the meeting. California sent a whole delegation. And so California, I mean, I feel very fortunate to be a resident of California, because we continue to do policy when the federal government fails to act. I mean, we're rolling things back in a way that is, our Supreme Court has decided that, greenhouse gases aren't pollutants for purposes of the Clean Air Act, which, when you do basic endangerment findings, that just runs counter to any evidence. I mean, we have a big challenge in this country because we have far too many sort of politicians who, I don't know what they actually think about the evidence, but they are swayed by what I would consider a minority of voters. Yes, I do know that the current administration, got the votes, but I think when there actually some of the conversations go on with individuals, there's a lot of awareness of climate. And I can speak to that with people who are considered in this country to lean more towards a conservative set of politics. The farming industry, they all are very aware of climate change. And they do support efforts, but they're not, they're more thinking that they want to change their practices. And here's what I mean, is they want money to do regenerative agriculture to ensure that they have a long-term future in farming, that they're not going to be experiencing drought because, our Midwest experienced a major drought in the last couple of years. It's really affected some of the commodity crops like corn. But that's been a really interesting sort of dynamic because these very same people drive, very much fossil fuel driven cars and machinery. So there is some contradiction, but there is awareness, I think. But I appreciate your point that the U.S. can't be relied upon, and it's really, it's more than just plain upsetting. It is, it's undermining efforts of other countries. When I speak of solidarity here, it's undermining efforts of other countries because the U.S. is such a big emitter.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for that answer, Professor. That was very enlightening. We'll move on to Oishi.
Hello. Hello, am I audible?
I can hear you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very enlightening. I would like to ask you, how effective do you think the IEL is in protecting the vulnerable communities in general, in your opinion?
That's a great question. So I don't think it is effective now because with every international environmental law, it has to be implemented nationally. And I think the challenge has been, and this is across the board. There are some countries that are doing better than others on this, but many countries faced what I'll call environmental justice or environmental racism, whatever you want to call it, environmental injustice, where marginalized communities tend to have less political power, and as a result, are less able to get, for example, enforcement actions. This is a chronic problem in the US where there might be, we have regular violations of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. Normally they're accidents and things, that the processing plant wasn't doing something. But the communities there, if an enforcement action needs to happen, if you're in a very wealthy community, it will happen very quickly. In a much poorer community, phone calls need to be made. Sometimes lawsuits need to be filed. There is a very much a tale of more than one nation in our own country here in the US. And I suspect that is true in many countries, that dynamic. A great question.
Thank you, Professor. We'll move on to the next one. Sohini.
Yes, good evening, Professor, and thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I believe it was a great start to my day since it's morning here. So my question to you would be, as a contributor to the yearbook of International Disaster Law, what do you see? Hello? Am I audible? Hello?
I could hear a little bit of that in the Yearbook of International Law. What do I see?
Tony, otherwise, you can type in your question at the chat box as well.
That would be great.
In the meantime, I think, Savi, you can move on to others who are there in line. I think Sohini can type it in.
Yes. Yes, Sohini, you can type in your question. We can move on to Dr. Bailey Brogan.
So I don't come from a legal background. I was just joined this out of curiosity, and I'm actually in the U.S. I was just curious, what would you say is the biggest failure for the United States in their environment, addressing a lot of our, key vulnerabilities, things like that happen every year, hurricanes, in wildfires in the West. How are we failing our own system? Because it's, as a resident, very evident that we aren't on top of a lot of those things.
No, thanks. That's a great question. I think one of the US's biggest challenges, and this could also be a challenge in India, is operating across jurisdictions. So in any given situation, I'm going to talk about wildfire really quickly. So when you're dealing with someplace like California, you've got state-owned land, you've got privately owned land, you've got federally owned land. And so you've got all these different institutions that are supposed to have responsibility for doing some of the disaster risk reduction, doing vegetative management in different areas. And there's inadequate coordination. And I think that is true across a number of other kinds of threats that are posed, is we don't have sort of jurisdictional solidarity. I'll use that word again, and I think that remains a problem to try to get coordination. And there are some good efforts in terms of wildfire fighting. So we see this with interagency work that's done. So when the fire actually breaks out, suddenly there's some opportunity, and it's not always perfect, but you get that kind of collaborative action in the light of an immediate sort of the immediacy of that kind of crisis. But when we're actually doing disaster risk reduction, and that's the reason why I wanted to talk about that fat tail kind of thing. It's because we think, it hasn't happened, the worst case scenario hasn't happened yet. And, we've got time. But then we continually see, additional flooding events, small flooding events, without necessarily getting coordination across our different jurisdictional mandates that different groups have. So I think coordination is frankly where the challenges, some of our biggest challenges lie with disaster risk reduction.
Thank you.
Professor, if you don't mind, I have a question as well. Usually, when it comes to India, the environmental policies set forth by the government is usually the federal government, and the state governments tend to follow primarily what the federal government sets in. We have a minister dedicated to climate change as well. There's a portfolio for climate change. In the United States, usually, if I'm correct, so correct me if I'm wrong, environmental policies also have a role with the state legislation. The state also determine of how the environmental policies will go ahead with. What would you
Right.
say is the single most important legal approach, a legal idea that India and the US can learn from each other to amplify each other's efforts?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the biggest challenges is ensuring that I think it's a solidarity component of including more voices so that there's active involvement by communities in their own destinies. Because I think one of the expectations, and I'm going to speak about the US here, is we have a robust set of civil society organizations, but there's often this expectation that the government will do its job. I mean, that's a fair expectation, but without the expectation that individuals and communities also have duties and obligations to each other. It's a different way of thinking about sort of what governance is. That's sort of my big picture. But I mean, more practically, you know, in terms of kind of immediate, is I think from looking for more sorts of innovative opportunities to cooperate. You know, it's kind of almost a new idea in the US that some of our departments are beginning to, in our former administration, not this current administration, there was some ocean policy and had this kind of work across a whole lot of different, you know, the Department of Commerce was cooperating with the Department of Transportation and cooperating with, you know, the Department of Health and having sort of new sort of what I'd call more innovative cooperative arrangements. I think that that's something that would benefit both of our countries. People not staying in their silos, people really trying to do multidisciplinary work. Because that's what's exciting actually about disaster law, is that it's not a singular singular subject, that it really combines many different things. It's a multidisciplinary effort. It's got economics in it. It's got law in it. It's got science. Yeah, hydrology.
Thank you for your answer, Professor.
Good question.
We'll move on. We'll move on to the next question. Anushka.
Yeah, good morning, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the amazing session. I wanted to ask about the COVID-19 situation. So, Professor, in light of the COVID-19 demonstrating how zoonotic spillovers can escalate into biological disasters with global cascading impacts. Arre, my God. Yeah. Global cascading impacts, to what extent should international environmental law evolve to regulate high-risk wildlife interactions as part of a broader disaster risk governance framework?
It's a great question. And I think some of this would be doing sort of cooperative work across the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization's already taken somewhat of a lead on this topic. But one of the things that your question presents to me is there's a movement right now to do One Health, which is to really think about ecological health, animal health, and human health, and to recognize that the intersection between these three efforts. And I think that there is much more room now in things like the Convention on Biological Diversity to provide this as one of the reasons for which we need to be creating some of this buffer space around wildlands to ensure some protection, human protection, human community protection, but also protection in sort of ecological spaces, because that's what's the sort of, it's been in the last, I was just doing some research on this, the last 80 years that we've really seen this uptick. And why? Because we're seeing increasing amounts of fragmentation of habitat, so there's a lot more interaction, some of it's literally use of things like bushmeat and other access to animal products. But we're also seeing it simply with people living in close vicinity to sort of areas that were previously wild spaces. It's much easier for transmission. And this is a recurring problem. It's something that I think doing ecological restoration will provide some of that buffer space that has to be respected, of course. And I just saw Sohini put in a question here.
Yes, Professor. He's having some internet issues, so she put in the question in the chat.
No problems at all. And so I see that she's asking, about the single biggest legal barrier. Okay. I think that's a fantastic question. Some of this, here's what I think. Part of it's crisis response. We're quite good at crisis response. We're not so good necessarily with anticipatory planning. And so some of this, I think, has to do with some of our cognitive biases, frankly, that there is a sense that we're wired, and it has served us well to have a bit of an optimism bias, that things don't happen. We discount things without really recognizing the exposure that we already have. So I think when people hear a lot of the information, including some of these statistics, and I'll give an example. So, 1 out of 10 people will have some sort of exacerbated incident because of air pollution. Well, that's 1 out of 10. What about, I'm going to be the other 9. I'm going to be in that other 9. That's sort of a really sort of common sort of cognitive bias. And I think that's what prevents us from doing adequate planning, so that we don't focus on the disaster risk reduction, and we instead just wait for the next disaster. And in some instances, another issue associated with that is frankly finances. If you're doing disaster risk reduction, it's costly. Climate adaptation is costly, and disaster risk relief is also costly. But when you actually, compare it, when you're doing risk reduction work, you feel like you're paying out for something in the future, and we're inclined to not want to pay large sums for work that's done in the future versus something that has to be done today.
Thank you for the answer, Professor. We will move on to the next one. Pradipta.
Hello again, Professor. Thank you again for your very insightful talk. And my question is actually very simple. Since your expertise lies in both disaster law and also environmental law, I wanted to ask and also know kind of your opinion where disaster law and environmental law overlap in practice.
Right. So I think there in practice, we see some of this with some of the adaptation work, which has environmental benefits. So think about some of the work that's done right now with sea level rise and storms. We're beginning to see, for example, natural shorelines. Instead of putting in a seawall, for example, which would be a disaster risk reduction, like a concrete seawall, we're seeing instead some countries saying, no, we're going to be replanting some of the mangroves. We took the mangroves out and now we've exposed ourselves, and now we're actually going to replant. So you see some countries like the Philippines, that's been one of their strategies, is to try to do some, what we might call, if some people are calling nature-based solutions, sort of doing some of this work of doing some of the restoration that also has important disaster risk reduction benefits. So it might start as a disaster risk project, it might start as an environmental project, but they have co-benefits for each other.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. Are there any more questions? Nikhil?
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So my question is around, like, often the environmental, or let's say the disasters are certain to population at a times. So we have now been able to see that there is a decreasing trend in population, and in fact in countries like India and China, then now the population growth has been at a decreasing rate. So what do you think, like, when the population in the world would come to, like, human population would come to decrease, or be then the progress in environmental laws?
Oh, interesting. The correlation between population and environment. There's often there's a formula that sort of looks at what kind of pressures we put on our systems. And some of the pressures are simply numbers of people, but there's also the pressures of lifestyle. And so that's becomes the challenge, where, I'll talk about a little bit, I know a tiny bit about China. We're seeing in China, for example, more and more meat consumption per capita, because it's a more desirable food for many people. That comes with its own environmental impacts, of course. And so there is kind of, I think, trade-offs between, numbers of people in a particular nation, but also lifestyles, if certain kinds of assumptions are made about those lifestyles. So if we want to have everyone have a car, right now, and we don't have a system that provides for renewable energy, in the sense of we're running our power grids on renewable energies, then you're going to have a lot of fossil fuel use, which comes with its own costs for a country, of course, air pollution, greenhouse gases. And so that's kind of a hard call, because technology is part of it. If we can get good technologies, those will offset some of the environmental impacts. But all technologies have some impact, So electric cars, we're mining stuff for electric cars. It's hard to have it's hard to be completely environmentally neutral. But we can be environmentally positive by investing in restoration.
Thank you, Professor. Do we have any other questions for Professor Anastasia?
Samir, I just had a question for Professor, and I mean, maybe
Yes,
it's
sir.
a very, very complex question. I just wanted to know your thoughts on this. So we, of course, in international environmental law, we are moving away from that hard law perspective. So when you look at the Paris or the other protocols in environmental context, or for the matter, even the Montreal Protocol, which has been there for a long while. I think these are agreements that has taken place because perhaps states are not very happy when they're asked to enforce something on an immediate measure. When we talk about the Paris Agreement, also there is a long duration of time which is provided for implementation of what is the desirable goals. And based on the present predictions or the ease of doing business, it seems like we are nowhere near the targets. Of course, Trump administration has already walked out of the Paris Agreement, this time in the COP that is happening in Brazil, Indian Prime Minister is not there, Donald Trump is not there, and the Chinese Premier is not there. So in this whole context, I think one interesting point that I wanted to ask is we already know there's a huge business lobby, a market lobby, which kind of enforces its own desires into the governance. What about the environmental lobby and then its own desire to enforce what is called as the environmental impact into the GDP? Because whenever we talk about the GDP, we never take the focus on what is the impact on the environment and the cost on the environment. So when you work with activists and when you work with scholars, do you see this lobby has any impactful voice, or is it growing over the period of time?
It's a great question, and one I'd have to think a lot about. I do see there's a push for natural capital, and so you do see that becoming a factor that at least a handful of countries are beginning, I think, to take a little more seriously in terms of it being an accounting factor. We have ecosystem services, but ecosystem services are about serving us, and there is a lot of calculations about loss of ecosystem services. So you do see a few countries like Bhutan, from my understanding. I have not studied Bhutan, but I understand that they actually do factor in, to some of their decision making, what the impacts will be on nature. They're trying to take a different development path than some other states have, but obviously a very small country, so they might have more flexibility. So I think there is recognition, but I also hear you that this is not the way that it's being approached by some of the big market giants. It is not a consideration. It was not something that I heard during the former administration here, the Biden administration, having conversations about incorporating, the value of wetlands, into a particular decision making. In theory, it can easily be incorporated because many countries use a cost-benefit analysis approach to adopting regulations. But that has not yet become a mainstream practice. It should be. But where my faith is and why I can get up every morning is I do believe in civil society's ability to help each other. I think that humans we are altruistic. We care, we care about our communities. And I think spending some of that focus, I talk to students all the time and I say, keep your eyes on the local, because even though my career has been in international disaster law and international environmental law, at the end of the day, everything has to be implemented. It has to be place-based implementation. And that's why, frankly, ecosystem restoration is so exciting, because it too has to always be place-based and typically local, And so to the extent that you can get a community buy-in to say, my disaster risk reduction means that, I think it's essential, that, we have natural barriers, that we are not, exposing ourselves by removing maybe forests that's providing important services. And so I think those are kind of the conversations at a local level that can create a very different world than just looking towards our national political leaders.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. I believe that was a good question. And on. Wrap up. So, am I audible now?
You are.
Sorry. So I would like to say that was a good question to end the session, the Q&A session on. So I would like to pass on to Pradipta. She will wrap up the session. Professor, if you're fine with it.
Absolutely, yes.
Yep. Pradipta?
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for. I know the word insightful has been used a lot, but thank you again for the insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Your analysis of the intersection between the international environmental law, disaster risk reduction, and the climate resilience has given us all a much deeper understanding of the critical legal frameworks that we didn't know of, and has also helped us build a more sustainable and safer future. I personally liked the parallels that were drawn between the functionings of both the countries, that is in India and the US. So thank you so much for that. And on behalf of the center and all my attendees and all my peers, I want to extend a heartfelt gratitude for you for sharing your invaluable time and expertise with us today. And also thank you to all my peers and all my friends to join in just 3 days before the exam and giving us time and giving us all of the energy and the questions that you guys have given us. So thank you all to Dr. Anastasia, Kumarjeet sir, Kanishk sir, Kumar Agna sir, and everybody else. Thank you so much for being here and supporting.
Thank you.
You so much.
Thank you, folks. Thank you for those excellent questions. Some of them I'm going to continue to ponder. Been a delight being with you. So
Thank you, Professor.
and
I'll definitely be in touch with you. It was
okay.
really refreshing listening to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a very invigorating evening. So talk to you again later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.